On the 14th of November, 1887, a 17-year-old boy named Cass Hollowell drove a hand-cut wooden peg into the bark of a fallen cottonwood along the Musselshell River in central Montana Territory, and by noon that same day, 3 grown men had laughed at him hard enough to need to sit down. By the time the first hard freeze came 6 weeks later, none of them were laughing. 2 of them had walked through knee-deep snow to stand at his door and ask with their hats in their hands whether he had room enough for one more person to sleep. Cass Hollowell had arrived in Meagher County that September with $11, a draw knife, a canvas pack that had belonged to his father, and nothing else worth documenting. His father, Jonas Hollowell, had died of a burst appendix in May of that year at the family homestead outside of Bozeman. His mother had remarried before the ground had fully thawed over Jonas's grave, and the man she married had made it plain, with the particular economy of language that violent men tend to favor, that there was no place in the household for a boy who looked that much like his predecessor. Cass had left in late August, not quite 17, carrying what he could and walking northeast along the Yellowstone because walking felt better than standing still, and the northeast felt like somewhere that wasn't where he had been. He found the tree in early September. It was a cottonwood of extraordinary age and circumstance, an eastern cottonwood that flood or lightning or both had toppled along a low bench above the river, and in falling it had split in a manner that exposed the interior, which was hollow for approximately 11 feet of its length and nearly 4 feet in diameter at the widest point. The tree was not merely dead and hollow in the casual way of old trees, it was hollow in the way of a structure, with walls of compressed, layered wood averaging 9 inches thick, a natural roof formed by the upturned root mass where the tree had torn from the ground, and a southern orientation that caught the afternoon light. Cass Hollowell stood at the edge of it for nearly an hour, walking around it, crouching to peer inside, pressing the heel of his hand against the wood to feel for moisture and rot, and then he drove his first peg. What he was doing, and what the 3 men who came to watch could not initially comprehend, was not building a shelter inside a tree. He was building a cabin and using the tree as insulation. Yes, this distinction was not semantic. It was the entire difference between freezing to death and surviving the winter, and it came from a specific piece of knowledge that Cass had acquired not through formal education, of which he had received very little, but through watching his father, Jonas, work. Jonas Hollowell had spent 3 winters in the 1870s working for a Norwegian timber operation out of Duluth, Minnesota, and he had come home with a number of practical ideas about cold, about the way wood behaves as a barrier, and about the extraordinary insulating properties of dead airspace trapped between 2 solid walls. He had explained these ideas to his son with the careful precision of a man who understood that knowledge, passed down correctly, was the most durable thing a man could leave behind. Cass had listened. And standing at the fallen cottonwood in September of 1887, with $11 and a Montana winter approaching, he put what he had heard into practice. The construction took him 41 days. He worked from first light until he lost the light, which in September along the Musselshell meant roughly 11 hours of labor daily. The interior cavity of the cottonwood was not large enough on its own to serve as a living space, so he used it as the outer wall, the insulating shell, and built inward from it. He split green cottonwood from a stand 200 yards upstream and used the split pieces to frame a secondary interior structure, set approximately 14 inches inside the hollow tree's natural inner wall, creating a dead air gap of that width all the way around. He chinked the inner frame with river clay mixed with dried grass, on which he had watched his father apply to the walls of the root cellar at the Bozeman homestead, and he stretched the hide of a deer he had taken in October across the doorframe, double-layered with a second hide he traded for by cutting wood for a Métis trapper named Edouard Beaumont, who worked the river 2 miles north. The 3 men who laughed were named Anders Volker, Cal Pruitt, and a man everyone called Sack, whose given name was Amos Sackstetter, aged 51, 44, and 38 respectively. Volker ran cattle on a section of ground east of Cass's position and had built a sod house that spring, which he considered the appropriate technology for a Montana winter. Pruitt was a former buffalo hunter who had constructed a half-dugout, half-framed structure with a packed earth roof, which was by regional standards a reasonable winter quarters. Sack had a proper board and batten cabin with a chinked fireplace and 2 cords of wood stacked against the south wall, which made him the wealthiest man in terms of conventional winter preparation in that stretch of river bottom. All three had stopped by at various points during Cass's construction to observe and, observing, to express their professional opinions. Volker had come first in late September and had stood looking at the cottonwood log with his arms crossed. He was a thick-shouldered German-born man who had homesteaded in Montana Territory after 8 years in Minnesota and who knew cold with the intimacy of long acquaintance. He looked at what Cass was doing for a long time before he spoke. "That tree is going to wick every bit of moisture out of the ground and into your walls," he said. "You'll be sleeping in a wet box by December." It was a legitimate concern. Cottonwood holds moisture, and moisture in a wall is thermal mass that works against you, pulling heat from the interior and conducting cold inward. What Volker did not know, because he had not been told by a Norwegian timber worker in Duluth, was that Cass had taken steps to address exactly this problem. The tree had been dead and drying in the sun since at least the previous spring. Cass had tested the interior walls with his thumbnail in multiple locations and found the wood firm, pale, and dry throughout. More importantly, the interior structure he was building was separated from the tree walls by that 14-inch air gap, meaning moisture from the outer shell would never contact the inner living space, regardless of what the cottonwood did in a wet season. The dead air layer was not merely insulation, it was a moisture barrier. Cass explained this to Volker in careful terms, and Volker listened, and then Volker said, "You are 17 years old and you're going to freeze to death in that tree," and walked back to his sod house. Pruitt came in October and was more direct. He looked at the structure for perhaps 2 minutes, said, "Boy, I have spent 3 winters in holes in the ground, and I'm telling you that nothing that has tree bark on the outside of it will hold heat," and left. Sack came last in early November, just before Cass drove the final peg and considered the structure finished. And Sack was the most thorough critic of the three because Sack was the most intelligent man among them and had the most conventional reasoning to offer. He walked around the entire structure. He pressed on the outer bark. He crouched at the door and looked inside at the inner walls. He stood up and looked at Cass with an expression that contained genuine concern rather than mockery, which Cass recognized and appreciated even then. "You have no chimney," Sack said. He was correct. Cass had no stovepipe, no fireplace, no chimney of any kind. He had a small sheet iron box he had purchased from Edouard Beaumont's wife for 75 cents, perforated with holes in a pattern he had punched himself, which served as a radiant heater when he burned small amounts of wood inside it. And with the smoke directed through a clay-packed channel, he had cut through the upper surface of the cottonwood trunk at an angle. It was not a chimney by any conventional definition. It was a vent, and a small one. "You will either freeze for lack of fire or suffocate with one," Sack said. And this was the most precise and dangerous objection any of them had raised, and Cass took it seriously enough that he spent the next 3 days testing the vent system before he declared the construction finished. If you find this kind of story worth preserving, the kind where an ordinary person with borrowed knowledge and a clear head solved a problem that educated men thought was unsolvable, please consider subscribing. These histories survive only when enough people think they matter. And the algorithm that decides whether this channel reaches the next person who needs it is moved only by engagement. This is not about this channel. It is about making sure the next Cass Hollowell gets remembered by someone. The structure Cass Hollowell moved into on November 8, 1887 was, by external appearance, a fallen tree with a deer hide over one end. By internal reality, it was a thermal system of considerable sophistication. The hollow tree's 9-inch walls of compressed cottonwood wood provided the first layer of resistance to exterior cold. The 14-inch dead air gap provided the second. The clay chinked inner frame provided the third. At peak cold, when the exterior temperature registered 31 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit on the thermometer that Edouard Beaumont kept nailed to a post outside his cabin and that Cass checked by walking the 2 miles north when conditions permitted, the interior of Cass's structure measured between 41 and 43 degrees Fahrenheit without any fire burning whatsoever. That is not a comfortable temperature by modern standards. It is, however, a temperature at which a human being under blankets does not die. It is, more precisely, 72 to 74 degrees warmer inside than outside, achieved through layered insulation and trapped dead air rather than through the consumption of fuel. With the small sheet iron heater burning a bundle of sticks no larger than what a man could carry under one arm, the interior reached 58 degrees, and Cass Hollowell slept in that temperature in reasonable comfort through nights that were killing his neighbor's cattle where they stood in the open. The mathematics, as Cass's father Jonas had explained them to him during those long Minnesota winters, were not complicated once you understood the principle. Insulation works by interrupting the transfer of thermal energy. Wood alone is a moderate insulator. But dead air, still air trapped between two surfaces with no convective movement, is among the most effective insulating media that a person with no money and no industrial supplies can achieve. The 9-inch cottonwood walls were good. The 9-inch cottonwood walls plus the 14-inch dead air gap plus the clay chinked inner frame produced a composite thermal resistance that Cass, who had no formal vocabulary for such things, described in practical terms as follows: "I burn in one night what my neighbors burn in 1 hour, and I am warmer than they are." He was not boasting. He was reporting an observation. The mathematics were working in his favor, and mathematics, as his father had also told him, do not care about the age of the person they are working for. Anders Volker's sod house lost heat at a rate that Volker managed by burning between 2 and 3 cords of wood per month through December and January. His sod walls, which had been his point of pride, were effective insulators when dry and nearly useless when wet, and the moisture that came with the early December storms soaked into the sod and turned it into a cold, damp conductor that pulled heat from his interior walls with quiet efficiency. See, by the 15th of December, Volker was burning 4 cords monthly and was halfway through his winter supply. He told this to his nearest neighbor, a homesteader named Bremer, whose wife was pregnant, and Bremer, hearing it, began to experience a particular kind of fear that the Montana Territory dispensed to settlers with a consistency that bordered on generosity. Cal Pruitt's half-dugout performed better than Volker's sod house, as the earth itself provided thermal mass in a way that sod walls could not, but Pruitt had made a critical error in construction that he did not discover until December. His packed earth roof had been laid over a frame of green timber, and the green timber had contracted with the cold, opening gaps in the roof through which cold air descended with the patient persistence of water finding its level. So Pruitt spent December sleeping in his coat and hat and woke each morning to find the water in his pot frozen solid despite the coals in his fireplace. By Christmas, he had 2 fingers showing signs of frostnip on his right hand and was burning wood in quantities that he had not projected in his autumn planning. Only Sack was genuinely warm, in the conventional sense, because Sack had the board and batten cabin and the proper fireplace and the 2 cords of wood, and Sack was burning through that wood at a rate that was beginning to concern him. His walls were single-thickness boards with no insulation beyond the chinking between the boards, and single-thickness board walls in a Montana winter are, thermally speaking, only marginally better than a canvas tent. What they provide is wind barrier. What they fail to provide is resistance to conducted cold, which moves through a 1-inch board the way water moves through a screen. Sack knew this. He was a smart man. He sat by his fire in December and burned his wood and thought about the boy in the hollow tree 2 miles away and experienced the particular interior discomfort of a man who is coming to understand that he may have been wrong about something important. The storm came on January 3rd, 1888, and it came with the specific malice of a storm that has been patient. The temperature at Edouard Beaumont's thermometer dropped to 38 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit over the first night of the storm. The wind out of the northwest reached velocities that Beaumont, who had 22 years of river experience in the territory, so later described in a letter to his brother in Manitoba as the worst sustained blow I have witnessed in these latitudes. The snow that came with it was fine and dry and penetrating, finding every gap in every structure along that stretch of river and inserting itself with the thoroughness of a building inspector. The storm lasted 61 hours. Inside the hollow cottonwood, Cass Hollowell woke on the morning of January 4th to an interior temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit, measured by placing his palm against the clay-chinked inner wall and finding it, while cool, not cold. So he lit his sheet iron heater with a bundle of sticks and a handful of bark shavings and ate dried venison and melted snow in a tin pot and listened to the wind work against the outside of the tree with the sound of something enormous and furious trying to find a way in. The tree did not give it a way in. The 9 inches of compressed cottonwood wood absorbed the wind's thermal robbery at the outer surface. The 14 inches of still, trapped air refused to carry what the wood did not stop. The clay chinked inner frame took the remainder. By 8 o'clock in the morning, with the heater burning gently on a fuel load that would have lasted 30 minutes in an open fire, the interior of the structure registered 52 degrees. Cass read a chapter of the single book he owned, say a water-damaged copy of a Wisconsin agricultural bulletin from 1881 that happened to contain a section on root cellar construction, and then he went back to sleep. At Volker's sod house, 3 miles east, the news was considerably different. The moisture that had saturated Volker's sod walls through November and December had frozen solid in the January cold, and frozen wet sod is thermally close to frozen ground, which is to say it is an excellent conductor of cold and an extremely poor insulator of heat. Volker burned through a quarter cord of wood in the first 12 hours of the storm, trying to maintain a temperature above 40 degrees Fahrenheit in his single main room. By midnight on January 4th, he was down to his emergency reserve, a half cord he had placed under a canvas behind the house, until he was wearing every piece of clothing he owned and was still cold in a way that had moved past discomfort into something more serious. His cattle, in an open-sided shelter he had built to be adequate for a normal winter, were dying where they stood. 3 would be dead by morning. He would find this out when the storm broke, and he went outside to count. At Pruitt's half dugout, the green timber frame of the roof had continued its contraction through the storm, and by the second night there were gaps wide enough to put a fist through in 2 places along the ridge. Pruitt stuffed them with his spare shirts and nailed a canvas flour sack over the largest gap and sat by his fire and burned wood and prayed in the specific way that men pray when they have run out of practical options. He did not die in that storm, so he came close enough to it that he lost feeling in his left foot for 3 weeks afterward and walked with a perceptible limp through the following spring, which was how the Frontier recorded its near misses, in the altered gaits and missing fingers and permanent squints of people who had been close enough to see what the alternative looked like. By midnight on the 4th, Cass had burned approximately 1/8 of a cord of wood. He had maintained an interior temperature between 48 and 54 degrees Fahrenheit for 36 hours of the storm's worst conditions. He was not uncomfortable. He was not frightened. He was, if anything, slightly bored, which is perhaps the most remarkable testimony to the effectiveness of the system he had built. If this kind of practical precision, so the specific temperatures and construction details and the stories of ordinary people who got the physics right when their neighbors got it wrong, interests you, then please subscribe and press the notification bell. There are dozens of these histories remaining to document, and each one requires the time to research it properly. Your subscription is what makes that time possible. The storm broke on the afternoon of January 5th with the abruptness that characterizes the worst Montana weather, as though whatever force had organized it had simply turned away and found something else to attend to. The wind dropped within 2 hours from gale conditions to a light northwest breeze. The temperature rose to 12 degrees below zero, which felt, by contrast, almost moderate. The sky cleared to a blue so sharp and clean, it seemed to have been scoured of everything soft. Cass Hollowell pushed aside the double deer hide over his door and stepped out into the snow and stood for a moment looking at the landscape with the evaluating attention of a person who has just come through something and is taking stock of what remains. What remained was the structure. The fallen cottonwood looked, from the outside, exactly as it had looked before the storm. The bark was intact. The root mass that formed the natural roof showed no damage. The snow had drifted against the windward side in a long, smooth curve, but drifts against a log are neither remarkable nor damaging, and the structure beneath them was unchanged. Cass walked around it once, pressing on the bark in several places, and checking the clay channel where the vent exited through the upper surface of the log, finding everything tight and sound and unremarkable in the best possible sense of that word. He then walked to Edouard Beaumont's cabin, 2 miles north in the snow, partly to check the thermometer and partly because Beaumont's wife, a Cree woman named Isabel, who was among the most practically skilled persons Cass had encountered in his short life, had told him in November that he could come for coffee whenever he needed it. The thermometer at its low point during the storm had reached 41 below zero Fahrenheit. Cass looked at that number for a moment, and then he walked back south along the river. He stopped at Sack's cabin first, because Sack's cabin was the closest to his own position, and he found Sack outside in the recovered afternoon light, surveying the south wall of his cabin where the wind had torn away approximately 15 feet of chinking between the boards and exposed the bare wood beneath. Sack was looking at this damage with the expression of a man who is revising his opinions in real time. He heard Cass approaching and turned, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Sack said, "I burned through my entire winter supply. I have half a cord remaining and 3 months of winter left, and I near froze last night." He paused and looked at the damaged wall. "How did you do in that tree of yours?" It was not quite a question. It had the sound of a man who already knew the answer and was asking anyway, because hearing it said aloud was part of the process of accepting it. Cass told him, but he described the temperatures he had maintained, the fuel he had consumed, the condition of the structure after 61 hours of 41 below conditions. Sack listened without interrupting, which was a form of respect he had not previously offered on the subject. When Cass finished, Sack was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I told you that you would freeze. I was wrong about that." He said it plainly, with the directness of a man who considered accuracy more important than pride. "Will you walk me through how you built the air gap?" Volker came 2 days later, once he had dealt with the cattle situation, which was as bad as it had looked on the morning of January 5th. He had lost 4 animals, and 2 more that were still living were unlikely to survive the month. He arrived at Cass's structure with a wrapped quarter of a beef that he had butchered from one of the dead cattle, which under other circumstances would have been nothing more than waste management, but which under these circumstances was the clearest apology Volker had available to him. He handed the wrapped meat to Cass and looked at the hollow tree and said, "That tree warmed you." Cass said it had. Volker said, "The sod walls froze through from moisture and became cold conductors. I did not believe you when you said the air gap was what mattered." He paused. "I should like to understand the air gap." Cass showed him. Pruitt did not come for 2 weeks, which was a function of his injury and not of his stubbornness, though Pruitt had enough of both that the distinction was difficult to make in practice. When he came limping through the snow with his left foot wrapped in an additional layer of canvas, and he stood at Cass's door and looked at the fallen tree and did not say anything for a long time. Finally he said, "I have spent 20 years in this territory believing that a man needs a fire big enough to heat a barn to survive a winter like this one. That tree has made me reconsider." He sat down inside Cass's structure in the 53 degrees of a morning with the small heater barely lit, and he was visibly struck by it in the way that people are struck by evidence that overturns a long-held certainty. Which is to say, he went very quiet and looked at the walls and pressed his hand against the clay chinking and was for a few minutes not a man with 20 years of experience, but simply a man sitting in a warm space, trying to understand how it had gotten warm. Cass Hollowell spent the winter of 1887 to 1888 in the hollow cottonwood structure, surviving the coldest recorded stretch of temperatures in Meagher County that decade with a fuel consumption that Edouard Beaumont, who kept records of such things in the same ledger where he recorded trap yields and river conditions, later estimated at roughly 1/8 of what any of the neighboring homesteaders had burned. He emerged in April into a spring that seemed to him, in the way that springs always seem to people who have just survived difficult winters, extraordinarily generous. The cottonwood had green shoots at the tips of the branches that had still been alive in its upper reaches, which surprised him, and he sat for a while in the April sun looking at those shoots and thinking about persistence in the specific way that 17-year-olds think about it when they have recently confirmed that they are capable of it. He did not stay in the territory past that summer. He moved on, as young men with $11 and a draw knife tend to do, following the railroad construction south and then east, working as a carpenter's apprentice in a way that suited the skills he had developed along the Musselshell. But before he left, he spent 2 weeks in June helping Anders Volker construct what Volker called a root cellar with a dead air wall around the new cattle shelter he was building, which was in fact the Hollowell system adapted for agricultural use, and he spent 3 days with Sack walking through the mathematics of thermal layering as applied to a board and batten structure, explaining how a secondary interior wall set 14 inches inside the outer wall and joined by no conductive connection would reduce heat loss through the boards by a factor that Sack worked out on paper and then stared at for a while before saying quietly, "That is a great deal of wood I did not need to burn." The hollow cottonwood structure itself stood for 6 more years before a spring flood in 1894 undercut the bank where the tree lay and carried it downriver in pieces. Only a homesteader named Thatcher, who had arrived in the territory in 1890 and had heard the story from Volker, wrote a brief account of the structure's existence in a letter to the Mega County News in April of 1894 when the flood took it, noting that it had served as shelter for 2 subsequent occupants after Cass Hollowell's departure and that neither of them had suffered cold-related injury despite having fewer resources than any of their neighbors. The letter was published in a small type block on the 4th page of the May 2, 1894 edition under the heading River Notes and was not commented upon editorially. Cass Hollowell's name appeared in it once. What did spread through the particular mechanism by which useful ideas spread on the frontier, or at which is demonstration followed by adoption, followed by the forgetting of the demonstration, was the principle. Within 5 years of the winter of 1887, dead air wall construction had become common enough in the Musselshell River Valley that it was considered standard practice for root cellars and secondary agricultural buildings. By 1895, a territorial agricultural bulletin, published out of Helena, recommended double wall construction with an air gap for all permanent structures in high elevation locations, citing efficiency and fuel savings without reference to any specific origin. The Norwegian timber workers who had taught Jonas Hollowell in Duluth were not mentioned. Jonas Hollowell was not mentioned. Cass Hollowell was not mentioned. The bulletin described the practice as well established, which was accurate in the sense that it had established itself through the straightforward mechanism of working better than the alternative. This is how knowledge moves on the frontier, and if we are honest about it, everywhere else. It moves from a person who understands something to a crisis that demonstrates it, and from the crisis to the survivors, and from the survivors to a practice, and from the practice to a bulletin that describes the practice without its history, and from the bulletin to a standard that nobody remembers inventing. The origin disappears not because it is suppressed or forgotten through carelessness, but because successful knowledge becomes part of the background assumption of a culture, and background assumptions do not require attribution. Nobody asks who invented breathing. The principle that dead air is insulation, that a gap between 2 walls traps still air, and that still air resists the passage of thermal energy with extraordinary efficiency, is so thoroughly embedded in modern building science that the International Building Code's specifications for wall assembly R-values are, in their mathematical essence, a formalization of what a 17-year-old boy with $11 worked out by watching a hollow tree and listening to his father. If you appreciate the effort to trace these origins back through the bulletins and the standards and the forgotten letters in the 4th pages of county newspapers, to the specific person and the specific winter and the specific moment of understanding, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who thinks about building and warmth and the practical intelligence of ordinary people. The work of finding these stories is slow, and the sources are scattered, and the algorithm that determines whether this research reaches an audience that can use it is moved by very simple signals. Your engagement is one of them. Modern building science formalizes what Cass Hollowell understood empirically. The principle of the thermal break, the deliberate interruption of a conductive path between exterior cold and interior warmth, is the foundation of every high-performance building envelope constructed in cold climates today. Passive house construction, which represents the current leading edge of residential thermal efficiency, achieves its remarkable performance through combinations of insulation layers and carefully managed air gaps that are, in their underlying logic, the same system Cass was building in November of 1887 with a draw knife and river clay and the memory of his father's voice explaining Norwegian timber practices. The materials are different. The precision of the calculations is different. The principle is identical. Dead air resists the movement of thermal energy. A system that creates and protects dead air inside a structure reduces that structure's heating demand. A structure with reduced heating demand requires less fuel or less electricity or less of whatever resource is being consumed to maintain the interior temperature. And the reduction in that consumption is not a marginal improvement, but a fundamental change in the physics of the problem. Passive house buildings routinely achieve 90% reductions in heating energy compared to code minimum construction. Cass Hollowell, burning 1/8 of what his neighbors burned in a Montana January, was operating in the same range, which is either remarkable or entirely logical, depending on whether you believe that good ideas have an expiration date. They do not. This is perhaps the most consistent lesson of these histories, examined across dozens of innovations and dozens of winters and dozens of frontier settlements where the wrong answer killed you with a thoroughness and speed that made argument academic. Or do the ideas that worked in 1887 work in 2024, not because the past was prescient, but because the underlying physics have not changed? Cold moves from high concentration to low concentration through whatever path offers the least resistance, and the way to keep a space warm is to eliminate every path of least resistance that you can find and the cheapest and most accessible path. Eliminator that most people can construct is still, as it was in November of 1887 along the Musselshell River, still air held in a protected gap between two walls. Cass Hollowell's obituary appeared in the Billings Gazette on March 17, 1931. He had lived to 71 years of age and had spent the bulk of his adult life as a building contractor in Yellowstone County, where he was described as a craftsman of the old school who was known for the particular durability of the structures he built and for his habit of explaining to clients the importance of what he called breathing room in a wall. The obituary did not mention the winter of 1887. It did not mention the hollow cottonwood. It did not mention Volker or Pruitt or Sack or the 41 below zero temperature at Edward Beaumont's thermometer. It mentioned his wife, a woman named Clara, who had predeceased him by 3 years, and his 3 surviving children, and his membership in the Methodist congregation, and the buildings he was most proud of, and the length of time he had worked in the county, and it described him as a man who had built well. Which was true, and which, as epitaphs go, is not the worst kind of thing to leave behind. The hollow tree that stood as the first proof of his understanding is long gone, carried off in the flood of 1894, but the principle it demonstrated is in every wall assembly specification published by every building science institute in every cold climate country in the world, working quietly and without attribution, doing exactly what it did on the night of January 4th, 1888, when the temperature outside reached 41 degrees below zero and the temperature inside stayed 52 because the mathematics do not require anyone to remember who taught them.